Okay, so if an African lived through their contract, they were supposed to get 50 acres of land. And we know from these early records that some of them did. Some of them lived through their indentured contract and then were lucky enough to not get ripped off and got the 50 acres of land they were promised.
Because of the law.
Right. And the way they set up the Virginia colony, if you owned 50 acres of land, you could vote for members of the Virginia legislature, which made laws for the colony of Virginia. So in theory, what should a free African landowner do? Vote. And we know that some of them did. Some of them voted in Virginia colonial elections and helped pick the guys who made the law for the colony. So this is in the years after 1619. So, and it goes on for a few decades.
How ironic is that? Because then later on, blacks weren't able to vote.
That's exactly right. And that's what I mean when I call this ambiguous beginnings. You know? Because you can see here that it didn't have to become what it did. So the number of Africans here grew very, very slowly. And there was no legal slavery in this early period. So if you claimed somebody was your slave, you better cross your fingers, right? Because the law isn't on your side. By 1640, so that's 20 years after the first Africans arrived, there were only 170. 170 Africans in all the Virginia colony. So they were just a small fraction of the overall Virginia population. Slavery was legalized in 1642 in Virginia, not in England. By the way, you may be a little confused how that works. So the idea was English law applies here, right? But here in Virginia, they can make any law as long as it doesn't contradict the laws in England. So when they legalized slavery here in Virginia, did that contradict anything in England? No, because remember, English law just didn't mention it. Now when they legalized slavery in 1642, the way they wrote the law, who do you think they said it was now legal to own as a slave? No. Who?
Indentured servant?
No.
Anybody that came.
No.
The native.
Non-Christians. It was legal to own as a slave any non-Christian. So that has nothing to do with race. It's a purely religious form of slavery. That would include natives, most Africans, and what if there was just an Englishman who said, I'm an atheist? Well, you could own him too as a slave, right? Any non-Christian. So they've legalized it now. But the way they have legalized it, if you were an enslaved African, what might you think would be a good idea? Convert to Christianity. And if you could convince a minister that your conversion was sincere, that you weren't just like, yay, Jesus, but that you actually understood Christianity and were committed to it, then you were given your freedom. There was a pretty big loophole in the system. Because if you converted to Christianity genuinely, or at least convinced people it was genuine, you got your freedom. The African slaves who were here, and the indentured servants, who there were far more of, they lived a life right next to each other. If you were a master here, you probably, maybe you owned 20 indentured servants and 2 Africans. And so those indentured servants and those Africans, they lived their whole life side by side with each other. Their master brutalized them the same way. And so those Africans and those English servants, they drank together, they complained about their master together, sometimes they ran away together, and sometimes together they tried to kill their masters. So does it seem like something that we would call race divided the oppressed people here? Not at all. They were bound together by their common oppression. One of the most remarkable of these early Africans who emerges from these records over and over again is a guy who takes the name Anthony Johnson. Clearly, that was not his name back in West Africa, right? He adopts that name here. And it appears, from everything we can tell, that Anthony Johnson was brought here in 1621. Remember, the first ones were brought in 1619, so this is just a couple years after. And Johnson was forced to sign a contract.
Brought to England or Virginia? I know it's
Brought to Virginia.
Virginia, thank you.
And so Johnson was forced to sign a contract, which made him an indentured servant. He survived a bloody Indian attack a year later, where, as you might guess, the English had really angered the local natives by this time. And the Indians attacked and tried to kill everybody. And Anthony Johnson managed to hide and survive. Already, he's lucky compared to many of those around him. Then he was lucky enough to live through his contract, which, remember, didn't happen to most people with a contract. And then he was lucky enough to not get ripped off. And what did his master get him? His land. 50 acres of land. And that meant Anthony Johnson could now vote in Virginia's elections. He was a free Virginia landowner. And then he was lucky enough to find one of the few African women in Virginia. And they got married. Anthony and now his wife, Mary Johnson. Do me a favor, and please don't write that part down yet, the John Casor case, because we won't get to it for a few minutes, all right? Oh, and I should tell you, these aren't actually pictures of Anthony and Mary Johnson. I wish they were, but there are no pictures, so I'm using these people to stand in for Anthony and Mary Johnson.
They're models.
Right, yes. So now, with a couple working together, they could see from all around them what's the path to success here in Virginia. Land.
Voting, marrying,
And
being an indentured.
yeah, so owning workers. So Anthony and Mary Johnson bought an English indentured servant. He was a free African owning an Englishman. And now, forcing this servant to work with him, he could grow more tobacco. And soon, he bought more indentured servants. And then, he bought an African. He owned both Englishmen and other Africans. When he went to the Virginia courts, the courts sided with him against his English indentured servants. Because the courts at this point are not rigged in favor of white people. Who are they rigged in favor of? The landowners, right. They're rigged in favor of the landowners. And he's in the club now. So the courts sided with him sometimes against his poor English neighbors. He appears in court records over and over again. And at one point, he told the courts, he said, "I know mine own ground, and will work when I please, and play when I please." And that is where the title of that book from our reading list comes from, Mine Own Ground. That's a quote from Anthony Johnson. And so, I don't know if any of you are reading this book, but a big part of the book is kind of laying out the Johnsons' story in more detail than we're going to get to do here, really. He built his land holding and owned 250 acres of land. When there was a fire on his plantation, he went to the courts and asked if he could be forgiven paying his taxes this year, because the fire burned down his stuff. And the courts said, sure, and forgave his taxes. His sons acquired, one of them, 550 acres, and the other son, 100 acres. And they owned their plantations right next to their dad's plantations. And so his sons became voters in early Virginia too. And what did his sons own? Servants and Africans. One of his sons married an English woman. And there's no sign that anybody was angry about it or tried to stop them from getting married. And it appears that the two of them were actually deeply in love. In 1655, one of Johnson's Africans, a guy that he had renamed John Casor. So John Casor was one of the Africans that Anthony Johnson owned. And Anthony Johnson was claiming that Casor was his slave. Not his servant, but his slave. Even though Casor had converted to Christianity.
So Anthony contended he was...
That John Casor was his slave for life, even though Casor claimed to have converted to Christianity. This, the next step, really blows my mind. John Casor ran away from Anthony Johnson's plantation and ran to Johnson's English neighbor and said to this Englishman, "You've got to help me. That guy is trying to keep me as his slave for life." And the Englishman agreed to help John Casor. And the case went to court. And the courts sided with Anthony Johnson. And the courts said that Johnson could own that man for life because he had been a slave in West Africa.
Were they in the right?
So the court's argument was he was a slave before he got here. So he came here as a slave. Johnson didn't enslave him. He was a slave before he got here. And that court case helped legitimize slavery in Virginia.